Hey YouTube, AAA here. Since Trump recently left the Paris Agreement, I wanted to talk about my opinion on climate change. I found screaming crowds, a noisy politician, and a 90s kids TV star who is unfortunately slowly going crazy. Well, I am no expert about this topic, so I went to NASA, and they defined global warming as rising temperature due to fossil fuels, and they defined climate change as a broad range of global phenomena created from fossil fuels which heat the atmosphere, and can also lead to rising sea levels and extreme weather. NASA cited studies from the IPCC like this one, and had this kind of graph. It's become a talking point for people in government, like Senator Bernie Sanders.
Some 97% of scientists who have written articles for peer-reviewed journals have concluded that climate change is real, it is caused by human activity, and it is already causing devastating problems in our country and around the world.
Bottom line, carbon emissions are really bad, and if we don't stop producing them at the rate we are, we're going to kill ourselves, then the planet. Now, on the other hand, there are some scientists who disagree. Dr. Roy Spencer, a meteorologist and principal research scientist,
that the climate system is relatively insensitive, consistent with the big graphic that was shown earlier, where it showed that we're not warming nearly as fast as the IPCC climate models suggest we should have been warming. So the point is, a lot of evidence now is being amassed which suggests that the climate system is simply not as sensitive to our addition of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere as most scientists think it is. I also want to say, since we're talking about most scientists, you know, I've heard 97%, 98%. There's a recent paper by John Cook and co-authors who looked at thousands of research papers which have been published in the scientific literature to see what fraction, support the scientific consensus on global warming. Well, it turns out that the 97% consensus that they found, I am indeed part of, and Senator Sessions mentioned he would agree with it too. And my associate, John Christie, he agrees with it. In fact, all skeptics that I know of that work in this business all are part of that 97%, because the 97% includes people who think humans have some influence on climate. Well, that's a fairly innocuous statement. And that's something that continually annoys me, is those of us that are called deniers. It's never actually, I think the D word was actually used by the chairman today. It's never actually been pointed out. What is it that we deny? Also, this 97%, well, what does the 97% consensus mean? What do all of those people agree to? Well, they agree to something fairly innocuous, and it's something that most of us agree to, that humans must have some influence on climate. The question is, how much? And how much influence makes all the difference in the world if you're going to be basing policy decisions, carbon taxes, regulations, legislation, whatever, on them. It makes all the difference in the world. Exactly how much warming we can expect due to human activities.
Dr. Richard Lenzin, an atmospheric scientist,
or, as it is now called, climate change. We note that there are many reasons why the climate changes: the sun, clouds, oceans, the orbital variations of the Earth, as well as a myriad of other inputs. None of these is fully understood, and there is no evidence that CO2 emissions are the dominant factor. But actually, there is much agreement between both groups of scientists. The following are such points of agreement. 1. The climate is always changing. 2. CO2 is a greenhouse gas without which life on Earth is not possible, but adding it to the atmosphere should lead to some warming. 3. Atmospheric levels of CO2 have been increasing since the end of the Little Ice Age in the 19th century. 4. Over this period, past 2 centuries, the global mean temperature has increased slightly and erratically by about 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit or 1 degree Celsius. But only since the 1960s have man's greenhouse emissions been sufficient to play a role. 5. Given the complexity of climate, no confident prediction about future global mean temperature or its impact can be made. The IPCC acknowledged in its own 2007 report that, quote, the long-term prediction of future climate states is not possible, end quote. Most importantly, the scenario that the burning of fossil fuels leads to catastrophe isn't part of what either group asserts.
And Dr. Patrick Moore, an ecology scientist.
Temperatures and carbon dioxide levels do not show a strong correlation. In fact, over very long time spans, periods of hundreds of millions of years, they are often completely out of sync with one another. Over and over again, within virtually any time frame, we find the climate changing, for reasons we do not fully understand. But we do know there are many more factors in play than simply the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. Factors such as the shape and size of the Earth's elliptical orbit around the Sun, activity from the Sun, and the amount of wobble or tilt in the Earth's axis, among many others. Even the relatively short 300-year period from the peak of the Little Ice Age to the present has not been steady. The latest trend has been a warming one, but it began nearly a century before there were significant carbon dioxide emissions from burning fossil fuels. And there has been no significant warming trend in the 21st century. Contrary to media headlines, the trend over the past couple of decades has been essentially flat. Meanwhile, human-caused CO2 emissions are higher than ever. About 25% of all the CO2 emissions from human sources have occurred during this period of no net warming. So what are we in for next? Will the temperature resume an upward trend? Will it remain flat for a lengthy period? Or will it begin to drop? No one knows, not even the biggest, fastest computers. All the information I've presented, the increases, decreases, and plateaus in temperature over the ages and into the last centuries, is available to anyone who wants to seek it out. Yet to state these simple facts is to risk being called a climate change denier. Not only is that absurd, it's mean-spirited. It's absurd because no one, not even the most fervent skeptic, denies that the climate is changing. And it's mean-spirited because to call someone a climate change denier is to intentionally link them to people who deny the Holocaust. So maybe it's time to stop the name-calling. Predicting the climate, one of the most complex systems on Earth, with thousands of inputs, many of which we don't understand, isn't an exact science or anything close to it. Maybe it's just a tad arrogant to suggest that we can predict the weather or the climate or just about anything 60 years from now. The science is not settled. The debate is not over.
So, who do we believe? Now, I have nothing against going green and taking care of the planet. Sounds great. I live here. Like it to be a nice place to live. At the same time, it seems like a lot of the plans to stop carbon emissions have done little to, quote-unquote, save the planet. We should, of course, take care of each other and where we live, but doomsday talk doesn't really help. So this is just my thoughts. Hope this was slightly informative and fun. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next video. Alright, thanks.